Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I want to talk about lore and storytelling in Star Citizen and how it's going to define the player's journey. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons for their support of the channel and the Armory. So, we know that one of the main selling points in Star Citizen as an MMO is that you can find your own path in the verse. But does this mean that there is no story in the game at all? Well, technically Squadron 42 is the story portion of Star Citizen, but not everyone has it and not everyone is going to play it. On top of that, CAG have said that playing through Squadron 42 is not necessary to play Star Citizen. However, we know that the campaign and how the player gets through it can affect their character later in Star Citizen. Whether that be by giving you access to certain ships or locations, or by giving you some starting money and reputation. But first, I want to take a look at how some other games and MMOs handle storylines within their gameplay and what CAG have hinted that Star Citizen is going to do. I'm going to start with the easiest and most common way of building a story that we see in games, and that is a linear main storyline with side stories branching off of it. You have probably played through countless games that utilize this system, and in all fairness, it is the easiest and possibly the oldest way of presenting a story. Now, there are some interesting variations on this approach. For example, the choices that the player makes can affect the final outcome, and there doesn't always have to be one ending. Cyberpunk and Mass Effect are a very good example of such games. While the player is kept on a very linear path, the choices they make and the side missions they complete steer the story towards a different ending. Speaking of which, let me know in the comments which Mass Effect ending you liked the most and which one you got on your first playthrough. On the other hand, you can also have multiple main stories converge into the same ending. If you have ever played Elder Scrolls Online, you probably have an idea what I'm talking about. In ESO, the player is assigned to a faction based on the race of their character. These factions are at war, so the game can't put all the players in the same area or on the same path. So the base game has 3 separate main quest lines, one for each faction, which then converge with the same ending and the final set of quests. And on top of this, ESO has separate stories and quest lines for each area that the player visits. This actually results in ESO having a lot of diverse content all over the place. But it does beg the question of whether the locations drive the story or does the story drive the locations. The next possibility is to have a game that has a hidden story. A great example is Dark Souls and related games. Dark Souls presents the player with very little of the story directly. Some players will even beat the games without realizing that there is a deep lore and stories involved. The player has to find the stories, either by finding hidden notes or repeatedly talking to characters they meet. This approach is very difficult and very risky, but can be quite rewarding for the player if they choose to seek the story. If you like the Souls games and you didn't know that there is a story, I would highly suggest you listen to a summary because there's a lot of good writing in there. And then we also have the possibility of almost completely freeing the gameplay from the story. League of Legends is actually a good example here. Most players don't know that the game has a story, and most of those who do have no idea just how much. The world of League of Legends actually has a ton of lore and it is very well written, and this is only presented to the player through short cinematics with each new season and some in-game events. Elite Dangerous is actually using a similar system as well. While the game has a rich history and diverse lore, neither are very obviously presented to the player. However, to advance the timeline, the game hosts events that affect the whole universe. But also, to create a sense of advancement for the player, the game tracks reputation with the factions at the locations where the player is. This can create an illusion of a story for the player to follow, as reputation eventually unlocks rewards or access to areas or missions. However, in Elite, generally speaking, no location is more relevant than the other, with the exception of some main areas, so it's difficult to place actual stories in there or generate them procedurally. So what's the plan with Star Citizen? Finding your own path is great, but sometimes you need something to follow. We already have some hints in-game and some mentions from CAG on what they want to do. First of all, it seems that how you play Squadron 42 is going to affect your reputation later in the PU, and even grant you access to some items and ships. As we know, Star Citizen will have an extensive reputation system through which the players will be able to advance their reputation with certain organizations or with some characters. The better the reputation, the more characters will be able to find out about that organization or character. But I think it's important for this to be optional. I don't think you should have to click through several lines of story dialogue just to get a simple delivery mission from someone. But the option to ask them about something should be there for those who are curious. Star Citizen also has dynamic events that have certain impacts on an area and also bring some story elements into the gameplay. I believe that eventually CIG will have a large set of replayable dynamic events that will be triggered repeatedly in limited locations. And at the same time they will have a sequence of global events that will affect the whole game, which they will use to advance the story in general. And this is actually a good start. But one of the main selling points of Star Citizen is that it offers a very curated experience, and while there will be many procedurally generated generic places for people to explore with few remarkable stories to them, there will be many locations that are relevant, which will be built by hand and have a lot of lore behind them. And that's how we get to how I think CIG are going to build storylines into the game. CIG actually sort of talked about it, but more importantly they gave us a hint. You might have noticed that you can meet several scripted characters in Stanton, for example Twitch or Miles Eckhart. These two are examples of mission givers. I think the idea is that as you do more missions with similar characters, they're going to be willing to tell you more about themselves, or even give you access to a more scripted mission, similar to the PI mission you can pick up around Crusader. I also think that players will be able to change the influence of these characters by completing missions for them. CIG talked about this a few years ago at CitizenCon when describing new NPCs and virtual AI. The general idea is that some NPCs will exist in a certain area so long that they can become a mission target or even a mission giver. And I think CIG could actually utilize this system with permanent NPCs as well. They could create short quest lines centered around these mission givers or certain locations. This would give players a story to follow while they're forging their own path through the verse and visiting a certain area along that path. But going back to my earlier point, CIG have to find a way to make the story optional for players who don't need it, but also engaging for players that do. There is also a problem with balancing the reward correctly so that players are rewarded for taking the time to interact with characters, but don't get an unfair advantage by doing so. And with that being said, that's all for tonight. What do you think? Is there room for a story in the PU? Would you follow quest lines if CIG implemented them? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.